So we are recording this webinar. Thank you so much for joining us today. We'll be able to share the link selectively with those who request it. And so this is a webinar format. So for all of our attendees online, we can't see or hear you, but we are interested in having you participate today. So please do make good use of the chat box. We've enabled the Q&A function. So if you have a question, please feel free to type it in at any time. You can also upvote the questions, so you can give a like and sort of raise those to the ones that we want to make sure we address in that portion. And also we'll have some time if you use the raise hand function, so we can open up your mic and hear from folks directly as well. And we'll have a few spaces for that. Thank you so much to our panelists, to Steve, Art, Andrea, and Sandi, who are joining us here today, and thank you everyone who's joined us online as well. We had a tremendous response, and so we're excited for all of you to be here with us. I'll begin by acknowledging the land where we are all calling in from. So we are all here calling in from the traditional territory of the peoples of Treaty 7. The Siksika, Kainai, and Piikani of the Blackfoot Confederacy, the Chiniki, Bearspaw, and Wesley people of the Stoney Nakoda Nations, the Tsuut'ina Nation, and the citizens of Métis Nation of Alberta Region 3. And of course, we acknowledge this land as we are in this territory here as guests, and you'll hear as where everyone has come from today. But we do all call Calgary home, and so we are excited to acknowledge that here. As has been noted in the chat by some, please do feel free to offer your own acknowledgement of the territory where you are calling in from or logging in from today. So thank you so much for joining us for that. And Kristen, appreciate the note that you've made in the chat. And so we wanted to start as well with a moment of silence. And so we'll take a moment here to acknowledge the children and families who have experienced the trauma of Indian residential schools, specifically holding in our hearts the families of the Tecumseh Tesikwepem Nation. So we'll take a moment and pause and reflect here. I also want to acknowledge that we have a number of people joining us on this call from a variety of communities, and I think the timing of this session is poignant in the first day of National Indigenous History Month, as well as the week after the events in Kamloops, and so I wanted to just begin also sharing words of Chief Justice Murray Sinclair, sort of speaking to those who have said that Indian residential schools are not something that we need to be concerning ourselves with anymore.
Many people have said over the years that I've been involved in the work of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, why can't you just get over it and move on? And my answer has always been, why can't you always remember this? Because this is about memorializing those people who have been victims of a great wrong. Why don't you tell the United States to get over 9/11? Why don't you tell this country to get over all of the veterans who died in the Second World War instead of honoring them once a year? Why don't you tell your families to stop thinking about all of your ancestors who died? Why don't you turn down and burn down all of those headstones that you put up for all of your friends and relatives over the years? It's because it's important for us to remember. We learn from it. And until people show that they have learned from this, we will never forget. And we should never forget, even once they have learned from it, because this is a part of who we are. It's not just a part of who we are as survivors and children of survivors and relatives of survivors, but as part of who we are as a nation. And this nation must never forget what it once did to its most vulnerable people.
And so just before we start, I do want to acknowledge that we are reopening the trauma and re-experiencing trauma as a nation. And so for those who are looking for help or feeling the need to find supports, who have held these experiences, want to hold up that there are those supports available, and offer these that have been lifted here. We thank you for stepping into this space with us. And so who we are is a group of friends and colleagues who have experiences and perspectives working with Indigenous communities. And we're all passionate about building awareness and understanding toward a renewed relationship between Indigenous peoples and settler Canadians. And so we're here, and my colleagues will introduce themselves in a bit once we get started here. But that's our passion. That's here to learn. We collaborate together in a variety of ways. I also want to acknowledge our colleague Annie Corber, who's on the line, who also collaborates with us regularly. And just thank you so much for committing to this session to learn together. So now I'm interested also in knowing who you are. Our folks who are attending, and what your interest is, and what who you are and what you're doing here. So we'd love for you to take a minute and pop in the chat, and make sure you send the message to all panelists and attendees, would be great. To just words of welcome. I think where many of us are used to these Zooms where we can see everybody, this is kind of an easier format to manage technically with the large number we have. But also would like to know what you're interested, what brings you here? What are you interested in learning more about? What has caused you to give us 90 minutes of your time here today? So please do take a minute to post that in the chat. I also want to acknowledge that we are all community. We are all Canada, North America. We do have some folks joining us from the US. And so we are a collective. That the group of 5 people who you see here are not the only, we don't have all the answers. We are building our knowledge together. And so I would really like to encourage, we have individuals on the call today with a ton of experience in this area as well. As I mentioned, we have Annie, we've got Catherine Rockendell, Dion McGuinness, Janae Turek, Mike Reed. I know I saw Andrew Loosely somewhere, Sandy Carpenter. So we've got a number of people who are here with us who I consider to be mentors and teachers. And so would just welcome those individuals as well who have experience and ideas in this space to also please share. If you see questions you want to comment to, please do that. If you have comments to add to the topics we're sharing today in the chat, please do that as well. So thank you to everybody who's supporting this event and who's part of it, and please do continue to share. Okay, so our format for today, everybody loves a good list. And so we thought we'd make a list. And I originally called it top 10, but there's no actual order. They're all good. 10 ways to take action toward reconciliation. So we'll work our way through 5, then leave some space for discussion and questions, and then work our way through the other 5 and sort of close out. So this is going to be our format. As I said, as we go, please make good use of the Q&A function, which is at the bottom of your Zoom screen, or in the chat as well. All of our panelists will sort of keep an eye on that. But we'll start with our number one on our list, which is to recognize the diversity among Indigenous nations and communities. One of the questions somebody sent in in advance is, is this only going to focus on First Nations? As a question. And so even that is sort of recognizing there's a diversity there, and that many times there is a singular focus, and not recognizing that diversity. So I'll invite our panelists to introduce themselves, reflecting on what it means for us to recognize that diversity among Indigenous nations and communities. So Sandi, let's start with you. On your mute, hon.
You'd think I'd have this figured out by now, but Anine, welcome everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today and taking the time. I'm just reading some of the comments and really looking forward. A lot of you are wanting to learn, and that's great. I think we'll all come away from something very valuable today. So my name is Sandi Morrisseau, Sandi Indigenous, Saging and Donjaba, and I'm from the Saging First Nation in Manitoba. I've been working in the area of Indigenous relations probably really my entire career, which is over 30 years. So I am a residential school survivor of the day school, the Saging Indian Residential School, and I'm the mother of Saga Tay. He's 19 years old, and he is the first generation in our family not to have attended an Indian residential school. So my father attended, my grandfather attended, all my uncles attended. The one person who didn't attend was my grandmother, and I was raised by her. Her father decided, my great grandfather hid his 3 daughters from when the RCMP came to collect the children. So I was raised by a traditional grandmother, and she was very loving and very kind, and very, very different from the grandparents who attended residential school. So I feel quite grateful that I had that opportunity to be, raised by my grandmother, Margaret, and to be taught to be proud of who I am. And, we talk about diversity, and it is very diverse. We have very different experiences, even within our own communities. So I would, there's always an opportunity to talk about that diversity. And that's one of the recommendations I provide to people who I'm working with is, even if you have 2 communities side by side, recognize that they are diverse, that they're different. The Métis, the Inuit have different customs and cultures and worldviews than others. I use the example of I'm married to a Cree man, and I'm Ojibwe, and our son has learned both of the cultural norms within our communities. And also understanding protocols are very different. And I guess the one thing I would say is never, ever be afraid to ask First Nations. I think, with what's happening today, we're seeing that it's really important to have those discussions, have those conversations. Miigwech.
Miigwech, thank you, Sandi. Art, we'll hear from you.
Yeah, good morning, everyone. Thanks, Sandi, for that. Always appreciate your words. I'm a Métis, but I feel like I'm a very fortunate Canadian. And the reason I say that is I believe I was born into reconciliation. I was born into a very strong Cree First Nation background family and in a very strong English Danish family. And and it wasn't for the leadership of both grandparents, my grandfathers on both sides, that taught us that we were fortunate as kids to live in 2 different cultures, understand the cultures, but the opportunity to take the best of both cultures. So I feel very fortunate in their leadership and their friendship. They displayed their friendship and the family's friendship together that really taught us a lot about relationships and how to work and how to understand the diversity of our cultures and our ways of thinking, our ways of doing things. So I'm very fortunate to be raised in that family that led me to many, many years, 35 years of being an Aboriginal liaison or practitioner, being able to work toward the best elements of the work I was doing on behalf of both cultures. Diversity is one of the biggest principles and lessons that I learned to respect, and it is respect to the diversity of the Indigenous cultures that are in Canada. If you don't pay that respect, it really can put you in a difficult way of understanding the stories that you hear and the perceptions. And I spent my life and teachings, and again, was to respect that diversity and not unfortunately, there's a long time of Canada where the perception of Indian people was a Hollywood profile that they had of Indian people, and then the Indians and Indian and Indian, and that was so destructive and uncompromising when it comes to working toward building relationships. But the changes are happening, and I'm very happy with that. So again, adopt that respect for the diversity of Indigenous people, as Indigenous people have adopted respect of the non-Indigenous people on the diversity of French to English and all the cultures that are influencing in Canada. So thank you.
Thanks, Art. Always a pleasure. Andrea, we'll come over to you.
Vlami. It's still early enough. I can say good morning in Inuvialuktun. My name is Andrea Hansen. The name my grandmother gave me is Akan. I am a Inuvialuit, and we are Western Arctic Inuit peoples. I was born and raised in Inuvik in the Northwest Territories in the Mackenzie Delta area. It's a small town with a diverse population. We're one community in 6 communities in the Inuvialuit settlement region, which is an area that was created as part of the Inuvialuit Final Agreement, the second comprehensive land claim agreement signed in Canada in 1984. The town I grew up in was, we're talking about diversity of nations here, and our town was predominantly Indigenous, so Inuvialuit, but also Gwich'in First Nations, and we share an area. We live amongst one another, but have very different practices and cultures, traditional clothing and ways of living in some cases. Inuvialuit translates to real people. We're coastal people and Delta people. Many who continue to live a traditional land-based lifestyle, which is common in the north of the 60th parallel in Canada, common in many remote areas. But because of oil and gas exploration in the 60s and 70s, and then also an armed forces base in the area, there's a lot of diversity of all kinds in our town. I think in terms of how this identify or acknowledging our diversity looks for all of us is really, I think, like Sandi said, and a few other, and Art as well, just asking, keep an awareness of our stereotypes and assumptions, and try to know that people are proud of sharing who they are. So ask those questions. Like Anne has said, I'm a visitor here in Treaty 7, and as I've worked and traveled around the province, I've got to feel comfort in the communities I've worked with, in our similarities, but really have learned so much because of our different practices, our different, learning about traditional governance or traditional foods, ways of harvesting, different medicines and spirituality. So that's been an honor for me. And I forgot to mention off the bat that my work has also been in Indigenous relations in different sectors, but always working with Indigenous communities, which has helped me stay connected and also in Southern Canada keep learning.
Thanks so much, Andrea. And finally, we'll go over to Steve.
Danse, kinis masut misut empiezo. Nape nehel. My English name is Steve Francis. My Indian name is Painted Horse Thunderbird. This is an unexpected reaction, folks, but I think it speaks to the passion and eagerness I have for creating and contributing to better conversations between the Indigenous people of Canada and all other Canadians. we're in a challenging time, a mourning time. So thanks, Anne, for acknowledging that at the start. I've got many perspectives, many experiences I'll gladly share as we go through, today's list, call it. I'm Cree. I come from Treaty 4, Southwest Saskatchewan, Maple Creek, Saskatchewan. I'm a neighbor here in Treaty 7. Always appropriate to know the history of the current land location you are anywhere in Canada. All land in Canada, folks, has a history that predates our country. It has a relationship, an ongoing relationship to one of the three Indigenous groups generally. Please, if I could tell you one thing, think about the history and the contemporary land users wherever you are in Canada, and think about those natural resources and how important they still are. Whether you're in the urban environment like I am, living in downtown Calgary, Sandi didn't mention, but Sandi Morrisseau and I we're husband and wife. Our son Sagate, he's Ojibwe Cree, first generation not to go to a residential school. I went to one of the schools in Saskatchewan, for 3 years, and that's probably, my emotion, a few seconds ago, because I'm just connecting, just relaying and relating. When I was at the school for the 3 years, there were 5-year-old children, still coming each September. There's a generation, we're hearing about it and one school, and we're going to hear about more schools. But you put that aside and realize that as a former student, I think I'm a bit resilient. I think I learned the value in education. I've gone on to obtain a law degree, a political science degree. I've never, been a lawyer, a practicing lawyer, because I was telling my wife this morning, reminding her, I could never, as a professional responsibility, swear to maintain the laws of Canada, first and foremost above anything else, because I was born Cree. I was born with our own laws, our own jurisdictions, our own perspectives, our own ways of doing relationships. And I want to share some of that. In all the workshops, presentations I do, I share insight and perspective that other Canadians might not be privy to. So thank you for bearing with me, and please, there was a type question, I always say no question is a bad question. You're gonna, create an opening. You're gonna create the opportunity for somebody like me and others from the community, from leadership to respond, to seize on that opportunity. Conversation, so important. Dialogue, that's two ways, critically important. We're no longer invisible people as Indians, as Inuit, as Métis people. And again, you're seeing just one aspect, but there are positive things beyond what we're hearing about now. And I think really that's the focus of today.
Thanks so much, Steve. And hand to heart, taking a breath with you. Thank you. One of the questions that's come in the chat, and maybe we'll sort of sprinkle these in as they go. And Andrea, I'm going to bring you back on as well as we move to the next question. But what's one question that would be appropriate for a non-Indigenous person to ask if they're trying to understand and recognize diversity?
I will jump in. I think just starting with the way that I think we as Indigenous people would greet each other as well is, where are you from? Where are you from? It's just
That's great. And Steve, how about you?
Pardon?
How about you? What's one question that would be appropriate for a settler person to ask you if they're trying to recognize the diversity?
I like that question, where are you from? Because, it orients the questioner and the person posing the response to the question. Because whether you're in Canada or the US or any global location, that location has a history, has a contemporary current use. So there's a segue, you know, we all meet each other. And when we ask where you from, folks, we're trying to make connections socially and through family, because we're a people, you know, the three groups generally, we've been mobile. This is Turtle Island. This is our homeland forever, but we haven't been where you might come across us. We've got history for our travels, our family's travels, our ancestors' travels, and we're making connections. And if we hear the sincerity in the question, whatever it is, that's so welcome. You know, rather than, you know, here are the top 3 questions, you know, I'd say that's a first good one.
Awesome, thanks. And just in terms of using this session to also build the awareness of all people on the call. So Canada recognizes 3 distinct groups of Indigenous peoples: First Nations, Métis, and Inuit. And within those, there are many diversities as well. So there's over 634 recognized First Nations, around 70 different languages spoken, and that's just in that First Nations bucket as well. So there's plenty of diversity. I often have people think about, well, you know, would you call somebody from France a European? No, they're from a nation within that broader area of Europe. And so thinking of it in a similar way, there are distinct nations, and many distinct nations within Canada, and with, you know, the Métis Nation being a distinct nation as well. And Art will talk a bit about that as we go and what that means in relationship. Going to move us along to number 2 and keep Steve and Andrea here with me. So diversify your media. So I'll give it to Andrea first to share some thoughts on how people can do this and why it's important.
I'll start with why it's important, and that's just, it's the first step in reconciliation, as you know, is learning the truth, is listening to those stories and learning other perspectives. So having only one portal, one lens that we hear stories or news is so limiting. And I'll start off with one that is with a recommendation that's specific to where I come from, because I'm pretty proud of it. Since I think the 80s, the Inuvialuit Communication Society has been producing content. So you can find that going to the website, Inuvialuit Regional Corporation, but through YouTube for sure. Of course, the big one nationally that I think of is APTN, Aboriginal People's Television Network. When I first lived in Ontario, I volunteered with an organization called the Imaginative Film and Media Arts Festival. So all kinds of content films and other types of digital arts you can explore through that organization. And my favorite is it's YouTube. I think I could sit and read a whole lot more than I do. So a lot of it is while I'm doing stuff around the house, I'm putting on YouTube and I'm listening to Roberta Jameson interview or speak with Tanya Talega on Inspire's YouTube channel, or listening to Murray Sinclair lecture. And so I could go on, I suppose, all the different channels, but really, once you start searching, you'll find that the post-secondary institutions have, especially these days, webinars that you can listen to. Of course, if we're talking media, there's also old school radio, and we've got radio channels here that are Indigenous broadcasters. I could stop there, I think, Steve, and give you a break here. I'll give you a moment, but when it comes to media, I think I'm consuming a lot that way through. Oh, and I think TED Talks, look up Red Talks. There's so many great speakers.
Yeah, thank you, Andrea. You know, having listened to what you just shared there, wow, you know, I could busy myself, you know, with a whole lot of screen time more than I do already, because there are so many, outlets, avenues, forums. And that's encouraging to me because growing up, and I'll admit, I'm 53 years old, there weren't too many choices. There was the newspaper, still critically valuable, the newspaper, because so many of our communities, especially within the regions, provinces, are still into their own print media. I'm here in Calgary, so I think a wind speaker. In Saskatchewan, they have, the Saskatchewan Sage. I'm sure in BC there are probably others. And even for the territories, we're producing content in a way that 20 years ago, there wasn't the same amount of content available. It's almost like a generational shift, I think, because we're proud of who we are and we want to share that and communicate that broadly, and we should. You know, Aboriginal People's Television Network, every once in a while, I'll watch their news program, at least a couple of times a month, you know. But as a Canadian, who once lived and worked in Ottawa, I got addicted to CBC. So that's probably my first to go platform, and then, CTV, that other Canadian channel, because on this issue, Kamloops, they global seized on it. And I wondered, are other channels going to, and what's that going to generate? It's generated a lot of, print, a lot of words, and that's great. And my hope now is those words all turn into concrete action. And it's so doable. Uh, because again, in my day, and I'm not old, I don't think 53, middle age is too old, but my friends, we were just being educated. You know, uh, I'm still a residential school survivor. So it's my son who didn't grow up that way. But I went to school with other kids that didn't go to the residential school, but their parents had. So they were, through education, wanted to become journalists. You know, I did a 4-month course with Carol Adams, one of the early CBC reporters out of Saskatchewan. She ended up in Ontario and all over, and the North, and others. Sandy's got a friend here. I can just see her face. I can't recall her name right now, but another former, media person on the CBC, Carla Robinson. It came to me, so we're seeing more. It's like a generational shift. Our children now are going into print media, you know, uh, and telling our stories. There are more Indigenous authors, so I would suggest to folks generally, ask, any Indigenous person, you know, what's your news outlet? What do you consume? Because, that'll tell you so much. My little birth town, Maple Creek, Saskatchewan, I'll look at the Maple Creek news every once in a while because they'll send a reporter out to the reserve, for a ceremony, for an event, something happens, an election, whatnot, you know, because I'm about what's happening locally or regionally where you are,
Awesome.
and I say this all the time. Google as a search engine serves me well, and I'm not shy about saying it's probably my preference, only because I don't look at too many other things. I can be distracted too easily. So ask Indigenous people, colleagues, ask service providers for Indigenous communities and businesses. What is their source?
Awesome. Thanks, Steve. And I think as depending on where you're at, Google can be great if you're able to have your own filter on. And I think many Canadians sort of are at various different stages in their reconciliation journey. And so sometimes a Google search you don't know what you don't know, and you don't know if what you're looking at is sort of the filter put on for you, or sort of something that is representative of community views. Thanks so much to Thalia and Annie for posting in the chat, and Janae as well. Please, colleagues on the line, share your media. Diversifying your media and sort of where you get your news from. There's a ton of Indigenous journalists and Indigenous authors and podcasts, and like there's a ton out there, and you don't have to look very hard for it, but we'll make it easy on you and post some recommendations. So that is absolutely an easy action to take to diversify the perspectives that you're taking in media and the stories that you're hearing. Andrea, I'm gonna boot you off and bring Art back on. And Steve, I'll keep you here for one more of these. So our third is to go out, be in community, attend an Indigenous event or celebration, and spend time in that oral tradition. And so part of what this session is intended to do as well is to teach through story, through experiences, through perspectives. I think often in a Western way, we are used to sort of the very linear way of learning, or it might be written documentation. But the oral tradition is a beautiful way to learn. I know there are many elders who, when I talk to, I feel like I walk away knowing less, because I've just sort of had my mind shifted in a new way. And I think when we're in oral tradition and we're hearing those stories, everybody takes something different from that, and you take what you need to. As long as you're listening with that open heart and that open mind and that intention. So I'll just invite everybody on the call here today to also listen in with that intention, to try to avoid those distractions of the emails and the other things and have us as background noise, but challenge yourself to spend time in that oral tradition with us here. Art, I'll get you to kick us off. Can you give some examples of how people might find an event or celebration to connect with?
Well, I'll speak to an early experience I had with one of my responsibilities at the company I was working for, and that was back then it was bring Native awareness into our culture, into our employees' understanding. So I'd go out into the different regions and talk to the people there around the Indigenous people or Native people back then, and I'd mentioned that you have a strong First Nations community right neighboring your town. I says, have you been out to that community at all? And it's funny to hear the feedback from a lot of the company members that lived in these communities. They're born and raised in those communities and never did ever go into the community next door to them and spend time to know them. And it's fascinating. There's an apprehension of fear and not welcome, but so we incorporated support for our employees, even taking time off of work to go and attend different events in the community, and that really created a different understanding and relationship, and I really do encourage that. I've never been to a closed powwow where we were never welcome to attend, and I spent many hours listening to the stories from the elders and the knowledge holders in these communities over the course of my many years with the company. And the biggest feedback I heard from a lot of the elders was the welcoming of lawn chairs. It's fascinating. Sitting on the ground and telling stories sometimes were hard, but sitting on lawn chairs was a lot more comfortable to sit and share stories with. So that was a common thing throughout my time with the elders. But listening to the stories, you learn not only about the individual, but the individual's experience about being who they were in the communities that they lived. And that gives you a lot of knowledge. It really does give you a lot of knowledge around that specific community and about the people who were all there. So orally, I enjoyed it. My kids used to ask me, Dad, what do you do for a living? And I said, well, I meet people. And that's exactly what I did. I meet, and we shared a lot over feasts and food. It was extremely common, and listening to the stories. And my job initially, early days of being a liaison, was to listen to the stories and do some form of interpretation and understanding and bringing them to the tabletop project tables to explain to the engineers what the impact of this activity on the land is going to be relative to the indigenous people that live there. So that was my many years of sitting and listening. So I'm a great believer in oral tradition and listening to the stories, and many who know me well. I can spend all day telling stories, and I've learned that trade very well. So thank you.
Thanks for that, Art. Steve?
I think reaching out, folks, it's opportunities like this. It's accessing public information. A lot of communities have websites, governments, you know, provincial, territorial, federal, maintain inventories of local connections for, all Canadians to reach out to for different reasons. But when it comes to social and culture, there's an opportunity. A powwow, is probably a term a lot of people can relate to, you know, or a Treaty Day celebration, or, a Métis jigging contest, right? Or, the Northern Arctic Winter Games. You know, there are opportunities where you have to, you know, commit to an action, whether it's clicking on a website, phoning a number and asking. Uh, you may, be referred to somebody that'll say, this is how you come into community. Always be mindful of protocol and tradition. I'm Cree, I'm from Treaty 4. I'm living in Treaty 7. So if I was to go to a powwow, to a rodeo, to their Sundance, to one of their ceremonial or social events, I would ask somebody that I know, probably first, is it okay, to come, to participate, to observe, to watch, you know, and for the time you might get no, or I'm not sure, the next person is going to say yes, because in sharing our oral tradition, our oral history, we're educating and keeping alive something important locally to us as Indigenous, and we're willing to share that. Just like Art shared his story, that's a process. You got to be comfortable with, not just a checklist of 5 questions that you need to ask. Take those 5 questions, but be prepared to maybe sit and have tea and have a visit and have a mutual two-way conversation, and you'll find that you'll get the answers to your 5 questions. It's different. Uh, folks, in 1997, very important Supreme Court case, Delgamuukw in BC, finally in 1997 recognized Indigenous people's oral tradition and practice as comparable evidence, as something that is legitimate. As Indigenous people, we knew this for ourselves, but we needed the Supreme Court justices to say and endorse oral tradition as practiced by Canada's 3 Indigenous groups is valid. From that spawns journalism, education, and this sharing, because, bear in mind cultural values of communities, of the, Inuit community, of the Métis community, of the Cree Ojibwe community, and if you think respect and act from that place and demonstrate that, boy, you're going to get far. And respectfully listening and approaching an elder, a knowledge keeper from one of the 3 groups, they'll realize what's happening, and they'll be embracing towards you, and you'll get traction. Trust me. I've been told no by other Indian people for communities I've gone, but then I haven't given up. I've asked the next person who is having a better day, maybe. It might be just that simple.
Oh, thanks for that, Steve. I think that's, we had a question in the Q&A of someone who had been used to experiencing and being welcomed sort of in ceremony, and then went to a different territory, and that wasn't the same view. And just love that encouragement to don't let that stop you from sort of that one, then you've asked and said no, and then so you go and find somewhere else, and respect that interest. But again, just as you wouldn't assume that, don't assume that the same thing happens in every community or where you're or the person that you're speaking to. Quick question, Steve, one more for you. You mentioned a chicken contest. Is that a chicken dance? Dancer contest?
Well,
Favorite things.
at a wedding for sure, but maybe I'm not speaking clearly enough. I meant, you know, a Métis jigging, you know, festival or
Jigging
contest.
Got it.
Yeah, you
A
know,
jigging
used to
contest.
attend Batoche annual celebrations because, you know, my family also has that Métis heritage in culture, you know, because of my grandfather, or my grandmother rather, and her extended family, you know, Métis name Flamand, you know, and my
Art,
aunts.
has Art won a jigging contest in his day? I gotta go.
Have I won one? Not recently, but I did when I was, my grandfather used to be very proud to teach jigging throughout the region around St. Albert and that. So we were born with the music, and a little bit of humor was, you can drive, how do you drive a Métis crazy is nail his foot to the ground, play some fiddle music. And so, so
Yeah.
that's quite inherent. And I tell you, it does, every time I hear the fiddle music, it does resonate with me, because that's, I used to fall asleep at night with my parents and members in the community in our house, fiddling and dancing all night. So it was, it's those sort of things that were quite relevant. And I know the celebrations, the Métis celebrations we have, they're a lot of fun, and there's a lot of non-Indigenous, non-Métis people there, a lot of First Nations people, and fascinating. Spend time up in Nunavik and with the Gwich'in, and Red River Jig is a traditional dance of the Gwich'in people. I come to learn when I went up there to visit them, because they got a faster step, and when I tried to show them our step, I was way too slow for their fast step. So that was a lot of fun, spend time with them and trying to keep up with them, to be honest with you. So
Awesome. And I think one that just reminds me of, so I was part of planning a conference, a virtual conference last year, and we invited a Métis jigging demonstration as part of that conference as the sort of entertainment and event. So Art had connected me with the folks from Métis Crossing. So that's another organization that will have public events, and it's all about education. And so to consider, if you're hosting an event, how you might incorporate Indigenous performances and people and perspectives into those. Okay, we're gonna move along and keep moving. And Andrea, I could tell you wanted to talk about jigging.
How did you know? Art, my dad is on listening, I believe, today, and he could play the Red River Jig. So yes, I definitely wanted to jump in and say another thing that during this, you know, lockdown phase that we can take in is the jigging contest that happened during Jamboree. So up north, we don't have, you know, we don't have treaty celebrations, and traditionally it's spring, it's seasons that bring people to do different things, right? So springtime is gathering and celebrating, and the sun's up almost all the time. So you can jig all night long, and we do, or I shouldn't say we, I'm not that good, but you can watch those jigging contests online now, because that's where they've had to go. So.
Very cool. Awesome. So we'll flip to the next one, number 4. And Sandi, let's kick it off with you. Talking about getting to know the TRC.
Thank you, Anne, and thank you all for those wonderful ideas. And the other thing I'm just going to throw in is Calgary Stampede offers a really great opportunity to learn about Treaty 7. So if you go to the Indian Village there, that's important. The other thing I would recommend is, you know, June is Indigenous Awareness Month. And then of course, June 21st is a National Day of Celebration for Indigenous people in Canada. So there's there's lots of opportunities to get engaged with the community and get to learn more about the people. So I'm going to just, the 94 calls to action, I think, it was released 6 years ago from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, where they, challenged all Canadians to, take on these 94 calls to action. Last night I was reading the CBC report on it. It's keeping track of, how we're doing in terms of, implementing some of those calls to action. And unfortunately, Canada has a long ways to go. I believe there was only maybe 10 of them where there's actually been some, concrete action on them. One of the things that's really important to me is this education piece, and we're seeing it more and more. In addition to my day job, I also have a consulting company with Steve, and part of what we're doing is educating corporate Canada on Indigenous history. And it's amazing how many people aren't aware of some of the things that, Indigenous people in Canada have to or have had to deal with. One of them, I will just, is the Indian Act. You know, how impactful that's been with communities, and how impactful Indian residential schools have been to all the three groups, because the First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people had all at some point attended one of these schools. So the calls to action are really important. There was, almost 7,000 stories heard from across Canada. And there's also been, in addition to that, even before the 94 calls to action, there was the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples. And I remember that, was a significant investment by the federal government. And unfortunately, a lot of the recommendations that came from that were never implemented. And one of the things I would talk about right now is Call to Action 92, where the Truth and Reconciliation calls on corporate Canada to educate their employees on the history of Indigenous people. So important. I think that understanding, and I think, when we talk about getting to reconciliation, we really need to know the truth. What happened? What is the history? And we need to have it told from the Indigenous perspective. I'm a big believer in that. I do Indigenous relations, and I always feel that it's important to have Indigenous people doing Indigenous relations, and allowing that space. I think that's really important. The other thing I would say is I also was I sat on a board with the city of Calgary that we provided advice to the mayor, and really proud of an important document that we helped author, which is White Goose Flying. And I, encourage you to Google it. I was looking at it again last night, and it was a group of us who really came up with an action plan of how the city of Calgary can implement the 94 calls to action. So the first thing that we did as a group was we were told to read the report. So that's the one thing I would encourage people to do. And if you can't read the entire book, at a bare minimum, read the executive summary that's found on the Truth and Reconciliation website. It really sets the tone for why it's important for Canadians to know, and go to the 94 calls to action, because there's something really each and every one of us can do. It's not just a call to action for Indigenous people, but really a call to action for all Canadians. And that education piece, I can't stress how important it is. And now I can see that, people are starting to get more, you're getting more uptake in terms of Indigenous relations. One of the companies that we're providing awareness to is they're making it mandatory for all their employees. So thank you.
Thanks, Sandi.
Yeah, thank you, Sandi. I'm glad we started with you. I still haven't sat in a session with you and Steve, and I can't wait. But I'm learning so much just listening to you, Steve, and Art today, and that was awesome, Sandi. I definitely would not speak as eloquently as you to the calls to action. but I would just drive home that education piece, because I think throughout all the sections there's sorry Sandy if you mentioned this already, but I've got them in front of me because I would have forgotten, but child welfare, education, language and culture, health, justice. There's areas for all different sectors to be looking for specific actions to their sectors, I guess. But education comes first. It's understanding first. And call to action number 92, because I do similar work to you, is in Indigenous relations, is what I know best, and it's the company I work for is also making it mandatory for at least a foundational training to be received by all employees. And as an example, I guess from one of the other sections, one that hits home for me is healthcare, and there is in that section a call to recognize traditional Indigenous ways of healing. And I think, back home where people have something terminal or are elders and they're in hospitals in Southern Canada, and they don't have their traditional food, they don't have their networks, and maybe don't have traditional medicines, and making sure that there's resources in those remote communities, spaces for people to be receiving both, I think would be something I would highlight, in addition to the one we work with most.
And thanks for that, Andrea. And I think it's I've been heartened, I think, by the different organizations that are interested in, once they sort of look into the calls to action, go, oh, like representation of Indigenous art and ways of knowing in public spaces. Well, I do architecture, and so how can I actually that legitimately applies to my job. Or I'm working with an organization right now that trains birth workers. And so how can we, in support doulas and birth workers in learning more and being more inclusive and responding to the calls to action related to healthcare and healing. Or I think we have one of my other clients on the line right now is a daycare. And so looking at early childhood education and how do we incorporate or consider Indigenous ways of knowing in connection to the land and different teachings, as well as the influence that we have within our community. And so I think this next one, and I'll invite Art and Steve back to speak to it, is actually think about your spheres of influence, that many of us are connected to different communities, whether through faith communities, through volunteer efforts, through our families. And so reconciliation is not just a thing that happens with Indigenous groups outside. This is for all of Canada. And the calls to action are really a great anchor for that. Steve, we'll pass it back over to you to share some thoughts about what this particular action means.
Sure thing. Influence, folks, everybody has influence. Anne just alluded to your role as a person, your connections, your network. You're able to influence people. I know Anne, has young children. If you're a parent, if you're a grandparent, I think fundamentally, if you're modeling and demonstrating positive behaviors and attitudes and values, that's how you can use your influence. I just kind of shake my head in a good way, when I hear about my spouse's leadership, her CEO, and how he takes a broader view of issues professionally, corporately, from a business point of view, and no voice, no perspective is left unturned. It's about treating people equally in that sense. You get to know more for a better informed decision. So that's good, and that's modeling so many positive behaviors. Your corporate values, your values that are important to you as a family, your faith group, your church, whatever denomination, will have values, principles, latch on, model those, I would suggest. And those are going to resonate and connect with that person, that Indigenous business, organization, individual. because things positive, attract other positivity, if I could coin that word just now, right? You're going to get a reaction at minimum. Everybody can influence others. You know, I'm a, I'm an oldest child. I've got 8 siblings and a whole bunch of nieces and nephews and cousins. Uh, I've picked up good behaviors, bad behaviors, but hopefully more good ones from my father, my many uncles, and many aunts and family members. And then from the elders and the knowledge keepers. The things that are positive are what I try, share, and pass on.
Thanks, Steve. Art, how about you? What are your thoughts on different ways that people can consider how they can take action?
Well, I was in this business of Native liaison many years ago, and as you got working out there and volunteering in different organizations, you ended up being asked to sit on different boards or influence, and sometimes it felt like a real tokenism effort from the organization, which is so. I was struggling a little bit with that in the early days, and my uncle put it in perspective for me. He says, "You take those chairs," he says, "because you're at the table, and it's up to you to have a comment, have a voice at the table. Being at the table is important, and let them call whatever perception they want to call. It's up to you and your opportunity to start the education, to start the awareness, and make a difference." And that really had resonated with me. So your spheres of influence are, again, thank you, Steve, for the family portrait. It is so important to continue to demonstrate that, not only to your kids, your grandkids. And I was fortunate, as I mentioned before, that I witnessed that throughout my whole life of relationship building and understanding and cultural sharing between my 2 families, my grandfathers, that led that, insisted on that with their families. They educated us. So I was very fortunate, and I learned from that. And everybody has a sphere of influence. I go from the group I golf with. There's not another Indigenous person with a group I golf with and travel with. And they always have questions, and they'll always sometimes make a negative comment. And then, of course, everybody looks at me waiting for me to respond to the negative comment. But it's always an opportunity to educate and have a discussion. And what I found recently, a lot of those friendships over the years, I'm getting phone calls from say, "What do you think about this, Art? I heard this on the news. What's your thoughts on that?" And that, again, it's another open door to that influence and that spheres of influence that each person does have. And you carry that, and you should share that through your own personal stories, your own education. And that's really relevant. It's one thing to say, "Oh, this person said that, that's what," but when you can speak to it from a personal story standpoint, it resonates and makes a big difference, and it's a better influencer for sure. So really focus on that and take the time to add those opportunities to share an influence no matter where you go, and talk about that, and be open to talk about your stories and your perception to it. One thing I want to caution though is that never feel if you're in that position, or if you're asking somebody to give that perception, it is a perception. Never ask somebody to carry the responsibility of the knowledge in the history. That is not one for one person to do. We spoke about diversity in the past, but it's very important to never weigh any individual with the responsibility speaking for a First Nation, speaking for a group of cultural people. Always put it in the context of a perspective, is their story, their perception, and ask for that knowledge, not the knowledge, place and responsibility, because that has happened in the past far too often, that an Indigenous person will be asked to carry the responsibility of the Indigenous voice in a different form and different format. And that's very important, because I've seen a lot of good people come and go because that was too much of a responsibility for the individual to carry on their shoulders.
Thanks for that, Art. And we actually had a question just come from Kristen that sort of builds on that. It sounds like many of you are representing your Indigenous communities in many conversations and situations. So how do you manage carrying that responsibility? That feels pretty heavy. And so it sounds like you're going to tell me. You go ahead. I can see you talking.
Well, again, and Anne knows it quite well. I always say it's my perspective. It's my story that I can share. And it's up to you, if you wish, to learn, to listen and share and ask questions. But I always never come out and I put the context out. I'm very quick to put the context out that it is my story, my perception, and that there's a broader community stories. And it's taken time to listen. That's key. Take time to listen to fully understand a combination of stories will tell you a whole lot about a specific community, a whole lot about a specific culture. And that's very important here. It's not to place that responsibility on one person. And we are all, and Steve and I talk all the time a lot, and we talk about our different perceptions. And sometimes we don't agree on everything, but we talk and we listen and we understand. And that's what the important thing is about in anything.
Awesome.
Say, Anne, just to build slightly on what Art said, folks, you know, we're Indigenous. We speak from our own experience, I think our own place in the world, right? How we perceive it. And I think collectively, I'm safe to say, we're trying to build that conversation space where there's better conversation, more back and forth. Because I think that's demonstrating respect. That's reconciliation in action. It's only in my lifetime when people are, you know, having the courage to ask us as Indians, as Métis people, as Inuit people. I've heard this from a couple of Inuit friends. I'm thinking back 15 years ago. Steve, when you deal with people, ask them to ask us. And this is coming from an Inuit person, because your experience, you know, as an Indian is different than mine. Your location, your perspective, your aspirations, you know, and in my professional career, and I know this is true for Sandi, and I'm sure Art's felt it too. And Andrea, you likely in your life, you know, you'll feel the slings and arrows from other Indigenous people, you know, who might not be ready to have that respectful, peaceful conversation just yet for one reason or another. So folks, you know that I get it sometimes. I get blasted, you know, I get threatened. You know, how can you say that? How can you work for that issue, for that employer? I'm creating what I hope is a safe space for that two-way conversation that's better informed. And yeah, I can only imagine. Art's heard comments, but I know he's probably, you know, had different reactions too. You know, because I've been there. You know, how can you think of me that way? You know, but folks, think of being in somebody else's moccasins or shoes.
Thanks, Steve. And I think, as you've all said, ask the questions, ask what that experience is like. And so I'm gonna launch a poll, because I would like the folks we have on the line, I'm just curious, because it's not all bad. There's a lot of good, there's a lot of awareness, there's a lot of stuff that's happening. And I have a hunch, and so I'm gonna ask everybody to vote on the poll that you have on your screen right now. Which of these actions have you taken in the last year? Because I'm guessing the answer is not zero for nobody. There's a lot of really good work happening, and I think it's important to hold that up, as well as, you know, we've got a long way to go. And there's a lot of good stuff happening out there. And it's as we build and as we talk more about it that we start to understand, oh, hey, that group was doing it. I fundamentally believe that asking questions from that genuine interest of doing better is what will create the systemic change. It's where everybody feels that responsibility and that accountability and that empowerment to say, well, what would reconciliation look like in this context? Is there an Indigenous vendor that could perform this service? I had a conversation yesterday with a company, and I'm just chatting while you guys are finishing this poll, but a company yesterday that was trying to figure out how they were going to increase their Indigenous vendor content and seek more, and they didn't realize that one of the main vendors they work with already has a ton of Indigenous partnerships. They just had never asked before. And so that sparks the opportunity for them to do more work and to continue building on that success. So I'm going to close this off, and we'll see that you guys are already doing pretty great work. So 80% of you are taking steps to recognize that diversity. Over half of you have actively sought to diversify your media intake, to find stories from Indigenous perspectives, and to be out in community, to figure out, okay, well, how can I actually take some action? So I'll share these results back and just say thanks for filling those out and for the good work that you're doing. We're going to zoom through the second half of our list here. And so apologies to the panelists if I cut you off or make you go a little bit faster. But we will be sharing, as I said, sharing this after, and happy to continue conversations and get in touch. So now, just look at my notes. Andrea and Sandi, we're back over to you guys. Andrea, do you want to take this one first?
Sure. It's and I have to say, I think for Sandi and I, it's fun. I love my beadwork and jewelry and handicrafts, and I know Sandi is very stylish and has probably a whole schwack of recommendations for shopping Indigenous. But I think the one message right off the bat is cultural appropriation versus appreciation, and the intent, like you were just talking about, and it's that the intent is what's behind it. Are you coming into with an intent to understand and to build cross-cultural relationships, or are you coming into just sort of to cherry pick a part of someone's traditional clothing or even ceremony or culture for personal, just for personal interest? I think it's about intent, and also watch out for things like stereotypes and romanticizing culture. So it's taking the time to ask and learn original purpose or meaning behind maybe it's clothing or a ceremony. So looking to purchase from an Indigenous vendor, of course, and online in Calgary. I know the panelists are all in Calgary, and so of course Moonstone Gallery is one I would always go to. But online you can look for Arctic Canada Trading Company, Indigenous Box, Raven Publishing, Mother Earth Essentials are some things that come to mind. And then just keeping in mind that a lot of these handicrafts and beadworks, the jewelry, they're not mass produced, and so I have friends who are incredibly talented, and they've kind of gone viral on social media, and people are wanting more and more and more, and they're criticized because can't keep up with the orders. But this beadwork and oftentimes the moose hide tanning, that comes from learning from our elders, learning from ancestors, and that this is something that's been passed down, and you can't just act, I want this tomorrow, have that perspective. So I think am I going on too long, Anne?
No, you're good, but we'll switch over to Sandi anyway and see if she wants to pick up.
Yeah. Okay, thanks, Andrea. Really good recommendations. I guess I want to just talk about it more on a larger scale. I'm thinking when I worked for the federal government many years ago, and one of the first projects I worked on was the procurement strategy for Aboriginal business. And, there was a real push at that time, 20, 25 years ago, to really engage Indigenous business in procuring services for the federal government. And just the last couple of months, I participated in the Canadian Council for Aboriginal Businesses, on Aboriginal entrepreneurs. And what they were saying at that time is this program is so cumbersome, it's not working, it's making Indigenous suppliers go through different hoops. And so there is a real push now to work with the federal government to get it right. And it's not about just ticking a box. It's about really, creating that economic wealth within Indigenous entrepreneurs. And it's so encouraging to see that we're moving, oh, yes, the cultural beading and all those cultural things are so important, but it's also important to create that economic wealth that we participate in. And we can see Aboriginal businesses are growing at a faster pace. In Indigenous women businesses are growing at a faster pace than all other businesses. So I think we're reaching a point where we're moving away from, I can't find an Indigenous business, to which Indigenous business should I be working with, right? And that's where we want to be. And that's what I see, I just see the progression when I worked in that space to what we're seeing now. And I just, a friend of mine on through LinkedIn, it's a mechanical company in Fort McMurray. They're expanding. So she, put that out there. And it's just so wonderful to see, because when we first started working with them, they were sort of a small startup company, and to see them growing the way they do. And even organizations like the Northeastern Aboriginal Business Association out of Fort McMurray, they started off with maybe 10 or 12, smaller companies. Now, if you go to their events, it's huge. So, and even if you go to the Canadian Council for Aboriginal Business, they have a list of Indigenous businesses that we can engage. So gone are the days when when you say you can't find somebody. You just need to know where to look. Miigwech.
Awesome. Thanks for that, guys. We'll move along, and certainly please feel free, everybody, to populate the chat box with other resources and organizations that you'd recommend. Steve, I'm going to bring you back on. I figured it made sense to have you and Sandi together in at least one of these. See if you guys think the same way or disagree. Have different ideas here. We'll let Steve go first with this. Give us just a couple of quick examples of what it could mean for a person or an organization to decolonize.
My legal training has me defaulting to legislation. We've got this Indian Act, folks. It, is with us since 1876. It influences governance, membership, identity, education, just those three things. And I'll add a fourth one, legislation. Those issues have to change. That legislation, 1876 and 2021. You could read the book by Bob Joseph. I think it's 21 Things You Didn't Know About the Indian Act. And then not to discount, the Inuit people, they've got their comprehensive claim agreements. The Supreme Court in Clyde River said the creation of Nunavut marks out their, Inuit treaty right to hunt marine wildlife, and that's going back to 2016. So not so long ago. And the Métis people have treaty rights because of the formation of Manitoba, it joining Confederation. The Supreme Court said in 2013, there must be a land base for historic Métis people in the Red River, Winnipeg area. These issues, if you learn about them, support them, it's the history you weren't taught in school. And if you support them, again, you're building positive relationships.
Thanks, Steve. Sandi?
Thank you, Steve. So Steve has a law degree. I have a communications degree. So just think about living with that. So I would say that, relationships are really important. And, stepping outside of the box, be willing to do things a little bit differently. I'll just share an example. I was one of the board of directors on an Indigenous organization. And one of the things we wanted to do was to indigenize the way we reported things back to the community or back to our funders. So we looked at ways like, how can we do this in a way that, addresses the accountability needs that were required for that particular funder. And so what we did was we did the written part, but we also included an oral component, because we recognize that, in our traditional way, in all of us, whether we're Métis, Inuit, or First Nations, that oral component is so important, the telling of the stories. So we invited people who actually were recipients of the funding to share back to the funders how they benefited. And this was stepping outside the box, and they love the way this is done. It brings, a relationship component to it. It also, um, addresses the accountability in a more tangible way. So I think that whole thing of being, decolonizing is allowing Indigenous people to do things a little bit differently, allowing them to incorporate their worldview, because there was a time when this was absolutely taken away from us. We weren't even allowed to practice our traditional ways. If we were seen outside of the reserve as First Nations people, we would get arrested if we didn't have a pass. We would get arrested if we practiced our traditional cultural things that we did. People would get beaten in the residential schools for speaking their language. So we've got to allow this space for Indigenous people to reclaim that ability to practice some of their ways of knowing.
Thanks for that, Sandy. And I just reflecting that there was a question that was sent in ahead of time, sort of that referred to Indigenous peoples fitting in Canada. And I guess I'd offer that Canada needs to fit in and make space for the diversity in our country, and frankly for the First Peoples of our country, and not just sort of on the margins, but truly look at our systems and the assumptions that are baked into them, the bias that's baked into them about what is right and what is the way to do things, and how we can create that space for different ways of knowing and being. I'm gonna run through these last couple, and I'll just actually open it up. I'm gonna bring Art and Andrea back on, because I know we've just got 5 minutes here left. And just if there's one person who really wants to sort of speak on any of these. But the importance of relationships. Art, I'm actually gonna ask you, you often have a lot of wisdom here. And I know I was taught by a relative of arts and a teacher of mine, Tania Gwynn, that we have 2 ears and 1 mouth for a reason. And that is the proportion that they should be used in. But Art, I'll pass it to you to comment.
Yes, relationships it stands in dealing with Indigenous communities different than any other society process. And one is that when you're interacting with an Indigenous community, it's a culturally based interaction. It's not a commercial interaction, and that sometimes get lost in what you're trying to achieve. And if you go in there trying to achieve based on a relationship, trying to establish a relationship, the first discussions that usually are talked about are common values. What do we have in common around the values? And I know from the Métis Nation standpoint, they have adopted the philosophy that when you want to interact with us commercially, anything, we're going to sit and have a discussion around what are our common values, what is important to us, and how we're going to go from here on based on our philosophy of the relationship. That is turning out to be very successful because it really clarifies where you start from. My successes that I've had was based on focus on that first and make sure that's mainstay, and not focus on the line items in any commercial agreement or whereas. It's really important to have that relationship. And my colleagues who have been tasked with managing a lot of those commercial agreements are frustrated over years of not focusing on the relationship aspects with the community or whatever company, but it's not, but focusing on the legal aspects. And usually they are trying to be settled downtown someplace in legal offices and excluding both the values of the company and excluding the values of primarily the community. So the relationship, but to my optimism, relationship is a key word now in discussions that you have between Indigenous people and non-Indigenous communities, companies. They all talk about relationship. Relationship is a key fundamental word, and that's very, very good to see the focus on that and the efforts around that collectively. and from where somebody meant common earlier, from when Indians were really invisible, they're not invisible anymore, and there's a lot more effort and a lot more optimism out there around that relationship component. So I can't speak more strongly about relationship because that was my task when I first started working in 1982. I was given a clear direction from our CEO to go and build relationships. And what does that look like? He said, I don't know, that's your job. You go out there and build those relationships and you tell us what that looks like. And that was a great experience of mine to be able to do that. The beauty about being first out, one of the first out there doing that was nobody knew you're making mistakes or not. So you could learn from them a lot easier. So, and make a lot more opportunity to influence. So again, I can't stress enough about trying to work on the common set of values. There's more efforts on that. You see that more opportunity. You even hear the federal government talk about relationships now and their efforts. And that's been a long time waiting for that to happen.
Thanks, Art. Appreciate it. So I'm gonna let folks know we're gonna go about 5 minutes over. So we'll just wrap it up with the last couple here. I'm gonna take this one because this has been huge for me. As a person who is a settler, grew up middle-class white girl in Calgary, not being exposed to any of our shared history or the experiences of Indigenous peoples. It has been just so important for me to have the opportunity to work with and to support Indigenous initiatives and causes and efforts. I feel privileged to now be on the board of the Indigenous Gathering Place Society of Calgary, working to build an Indigenous cultural center and a place for spiritual practice in the city. And just that's been such a huge source of learning. And so I would encourage folks to do that, but that's really where you're listening more than you're speaking. And I think there's, not seeking to impose the ideas that you have about what the organization should do or the way it should run, but really being there to listen and find those unique and subtle opportunities to support where your privilege and influence can be leveraged to support the goals of the organization. But those goals of the organization need to come from those Indigenous leaders that are holding it up. This is our last one, which is here, and you're all here, which is great, to be accountable for your own learning. And I'm gonna just look to my colleagues here for whoever raises your hand first that you want to sort of speak to this and emphasize what's important. And I would love to have a whole bunch of chats blow up about all of the resources and books that people will recommend for additional learning. Who wants to take this one? Art.
10 years ago, this probably would never have happened. What we have here today is a step forward toward reconciliation. The amount of people that are sitting here and listening, and the amount of panelists that have been invited to share their stories, that wouldn't have happened not that long ago, and there wouldn't have been the interest. That's what's exciting to me. It's continued along this journey, and I think all of us had a great opportunity to influence the journey and enjoy the trip, because it is going to be something that every day is going to make a difference. I'm expecting my 7th grandchild that I'm more happy to be bringing into the world and having her see, and potentially, if it's a lady from my family, make a big influence. I'll guarantee that. So.
Awesome, thank you. And so for those, our retention rate is great on this webinar, just so everybody knows that we haven't dropped very many people. And so now I just want to check in again. There's lots of good stuff happening. What are folks doing? Which of those actions have you taken in the last 12 months? And so if you see the poll pop up, please take that on. Awesome. And lots of folks sharing. And thank you so much to everybody who's been sharing in the chat as well for the resources that you're interested in and that you have taken up. Thanks, Annie, for the suggestion of Indigenous tourism in BC. Yes, when we are allowed to go there again, it will be very exciting, and all those opportunities. And again, this speaks to thinking about your own influence and your own different communities that you interact with, different positions that you hold. Like, as much as your identity is being a citizen and a community member and a Canadian, those are all opportunities to take action towards reconciliation. And so thanks for folks for responding to this. And I mean, everybody should be 100% who are here, who have been accountable for your own learning, but really looking for folks to take that action in June and continue to share with your communities. I just wanted to highlight some upcoming opportunities. So as I mentioned, we're all colleagues. We have other colleagues also. Steve and I have a number of public courses that are scheduled. So one through IAP2 in June, and then some on our own that you can register through the Forum Community Relations website. So those are available in the fall, specifically focused on engagement professionals, people working with communities, as well as those, we've developed a course on how to make a plan to put the TRC calls into action. And that's either personally, well, both typically personally and professionally. And so we work through a number of ways to do that. So you come out with an actual plan and some steps to take. Art and I also train in the Indigenous Relations training program through U of C. So there's 2 more cohorts of that coming up as well. So you can just Google any of those opportunities. Thank you so much, everybody. As you're heading out in the chat, I would love to get one thing that it lasts a lot longer if you write it down. Something that you're going to commit to do in June to take action toward reconciliation and to advance. So as folks are heading off today, I'll just ask you to share one thing that you're planning to do and to take that action and make that commitment to yourself, because as we say, we all have that role to play. So thanks very much, and a great big thank you to our panelists as well. And just because it was mentioned earlier, we will head out on the Red River Jig. Talia, I love that you're dancing in your shirt. Oh, I love seeing all of these. I'm definitely saving this chat thread. It's great. I think we've had a number of organizations join us for this. So I know CN's Indigenous Employee Resource Group has had some representation here. I know Pure Day Energy, we've had a few folks from there, Halliburton, so a number of companies and organizations that have used this as their opportunity to kick off national stuff. So I really appreciate, thank you for supporting us in this. The U of A course. Okay.
And I would just like to say thank you for organizing this and for all the hard work that you've put into and for engaging all of us. Very much appreciated.
Thank you.
Thank you, Anne, very much.
When you guys say yes when I announce. Awesome. All right, we will close it out. Thank you everybody so much for joining us. And I'm gonna leave it open just a little bit longer for folks to continue thinking. But we'll say bye to our panelists and wish you all well. Safe travels, everyone.
Okay.